Greetings, friends. Wanting here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine War update for the week of July 14th through July 20th of 2025. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this video around. Keep being amazing. We are going to be now going straight into the action here. We're going to be talking and starting off for the first time in a while in the Pokrovsk direction, because this is where it's getting spicy. This is getting very spicy right here. I'm telling you guys right now that I remember last week when I talked about, like, right now the only confirmed things was that, maybe the Russians are in Razny and Novotoretsk, but besides that, we don't know what's the extent of this Russian breakthrough that was brewing in this direction. Well, this week, all the bad news is coming in to the Ukrainians. All the the worst thing that could have happened to them happened. Well, maybe not the worst, but it's a pretty bad situation. Let's not get it twisted. Yes, it's a pretty bad situation here in the Pokrovsk direction, specifically in this eastern part of it. The Russian offensive towards Rodonsky here, this kind of pretty decent sized town here with the Rodonsky mine, which basically the capture which would cut off the road of life to the Pokrovsk agglomeration. This is the main supply route, and with the losing this would basically be it would be a death blow to this Pokrovsk agglomeration. It would be operationally encircled. That just means that basically everything else would be under tight fire control. It's going to be hell to even leave. They could still leave. It's not a full encirclement, but it's going to be, once Rodonsky falls, I mean, it's basically a game set match for the Pokrovsk direction. And the Russians have made rapid progress towards that town this week. Let's talk about it. So the first thing is that basically the biggest thing is that we have geolocated confirmation that the Russians have completely captured the village of Fedorovka, the village of Bofivki, and we also had geolocated footage of the Russians actually being right on the outskirts of this town that's in at the bottom of this mountain, the Chervony Lyman, in this area right here. Now, maybe that was like a forward detachment, but most sources are now confirmed that basically the Russians have reached these two water reservoirs here and have captured everything, right up to it. They have reached this reservoir and have captured everything right up to this reservoir. Along with this, some pro-Ukrainian sources are saying that there's Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups in the village of Suhusky here. We don't have any geolocated footage or map updates of the Russians being in this village or even in the village of Zachyshovsk, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Ukrainians are going to start falling back here, and by the end of next week, if progress continues at this rate, the Russians reach this rail line here and then try to enter Rodonsky from the north here. But we do know that the Russians are on the outskirts. Right now, at least for confirmed stuff, is that the Russians are right on the outskirts of Zachyshovsk, but it's very much possible that the Russians are moving through these fields and are operating in these areas right here to the north of the mine. So we just need more confirmation before we could say they're there yet. But we do know that the Russians are in control of Bofivka and Fedorovka. We talked about how they captured Novotoretsk. The Russian Ministry of Defense says they took the village of Mayaka, and so in this case, while we don't have any GLK confirmation of that, it's definitely possible that the Russian advance in the north is something like this rather than what we see right here. But right now, just most mappers are showing that everything up behind this red line is what's confirmed. But pro-Russian sources are saying is as far as this red line. So what I'm going to do is, well, actually, I will not do that. I was going to make like fuck it, let's do it. So in red, I'm going to do what is confirmed. Even this map is not exactly showing the full extent of, Syriac is actually very conservative in terms of gains. But in terms of what we're seeing, this is, in terms of like solid control, this is the extent of the Russian gains. Now, this is at least what almost everyone agrees on. This is now in blue. I'm going to talk about what the Russians are saying is the case. So in blue is what they say that it could be happening. So something like that. So right now some sources are even saying that they entered the mine, but they got kicked out of it. So it's like even pro-Russian sources are saying they're not like in the mine yet, but they're saying the clashes for this Rodonsky mine has already started. So anyway, so this blue line is is the extent that the Russians are saying are pushing, and then the red is kind of like what is generally considered like where most people are saying they are at right now. So as you can see, but very much rapid progress in this encirclement operation. Because if you look in the bigger picture here, as the Russians are pushing here, you can see this Pokrovsk Minigrad area is becoming a pocket again. Again, the Ukrainians like putting their troops in pockets, and so this is a very hot pocket. And so, yeah, very much very dangerous for the Ukrainians. The only thing that I would recommend for the Ukrainians is that they hold up, make a big fight for Radinsky. If the biggest fight right now is going to be for this Radinsky mine. So the biggest kind of linchpin to the defense of Radinsky is the Radinsky mine here. So if the Russians actually manage to capture this Radinsky mine, then this would give them basically it's almost over for Radinsky itself. The Ukrainians could still hold up in Radinsky, but then this mine's the best kind of obstacle they have to because if they could hold on to this mining complex, it'll prevent the Russians from being able to accumulate to extract Radinsky and attack it from the east. And then if they manage to get a foothold in this village of Chernel and Lyman, which we had GLK confirmation of them being right on the outskirts of this village, if they could take this village, then they could assault Radinsky from the south, and then obviously then they're going to be pushing from the north here, trying to reach this rail line, and then move southwards and attack it from the north to attack it on 3 angles here. But the Radinsky mine will basically, because if the Ukrainians hold this, then not only do they prevent the Russians from attacking from the east, they prevent the Russian. Then they'll have the Terracon, which gives them a height advantage, gives them being able to see around here, and this prevents would basically very much hamper Russian efforts to encircle Radinsky from the north and south. So, very much this mine shaft is the big key here. So, if the Ukrainians lose this, then Radinsky is next. They could, but yeah, this is where the main battle is going to be. If the Russians could take this, then it's game set match for Pokrovsk here. Yeah, so that's kind of where all the interesting things happening. All the things that we said were just kind of Russian, pro-Russian sources rumors are now actually being confirmed. A little bit more to this area in Novokonomishnya is that the Russian, according to a lot of pro-Russian sources, is that now the Ukrainians are being cleared from this town. We don't have, we have not got updates that it got fully captured yet. So we're holding off on that. But Novokonomishnya is starting to crumble, and if the Ukrainians lose this, then this is a very big town that the Russians could use to accumulate forces, and then from there, the Russians could then start their assault on to take this Terracon, and then also take this industrial zone right here, and so this is slowly inevitably Minograd and so forth. What we do have GLK confirmation, though, for is that the Russians are in the northern part of Novokonomishnya. We actually have GLK confirmation of the Russians being in these northern suburbs here. A lot of pro-Russian sources are saying that this entire area, like right here, is under Russian control. That the northern part of Novokonomishnya has been taken, which is definitely something that could happen now that the Russians are, in this reservoir here and are able to enter it. We also talked about last week how the Russians did a major breakthrough into Novokonomishnya. It looks like this map is not updated, but yeah, a lot of pro-Russian sources are saying the Russians have this area under their control. One thing that we do have geolocate, but the only thing we have about that is that Russian assault that sent units into there and disbarked. It's totally possible the Ukrainians got rid of them, but it's something that to keep in mind that we still think. To keep in mind that the Russians are able to enter this with will. What we do have GLK confirmation of is the Russians raising their flags in the village of Mykolaievka on the other side of the Kerensky River. And because of this, most map updates are saying that everything behind the river here, so Novokonomishnya is on the other side of the Kerensky River here. So everything behind this river, so all these fields, this massive trench complex that's between Malinivka and this area right here has been captured, and then all the other fields, so Mirulubivka has been captured, Mykolaievka. As you can see, Syriac is very conservative, and sometimes he relies on pro-Ukrainian sources that are lying. Not to say that pro-Russian sources you should just listen to them all the time. It's just that it's not 100% like what we actually see with GLK confirmations. But in any case, Novokonomishnya is now the battle for it has begun. I mean, it began last week, but and the Russians are now have entered it, and we shall see if they could crumble the Ukrainian defenses here. And then, so that's the east. Now, in the western part, like last week, there's been not as much interesting changes happening in this western Pokrovsk area. The only thing, but there has been actually some changes, but not as exciting as this eastern part. The biggest thing is that the battle for Udashina is still ongoing. This is where the Russians are focusing on the western part here. According to most map updates, is now the Russians have actually managed to cut this highway that connects the Ukrainians and the Russians captured this area right here and managed to cut this highway, this road that connects Udashina to Ukrainian positions in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast here, which this is just slowly encircling Udashina. I have no clue. I think some pro-Russian sources are saying the Russians are in the southern part of this Udashina, so kind of being split by this rail line, but we don't have any GLK confirmation of that. So it seems like the Russians are slowly but surely creeping up to Udachna, but the Ukrainians are putting up a fierce fight for it. But and then also in Zvornia, this is also where a lot of big clashes are happening. But we don't know exactly, where the Russians are. Have the Russians taken the small Terrakon here, or have they now entered Linonichnia and this try to capture it? We don't know the extent of the Russian gains here, but we do know the Russians are in Zornia, but we don't know the extent of their control over this village there. So yeah, that's the Pokrovsk direction. Lots of interesting things happening in terms of the Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians here are in very deep doo doo. It's a very big trouble here. So it's very interesting to see if they manage to hold on to this. I think, as things could collapse very rapidly, especially so. My thing is that the key to it is Rodinsky. If the town of Rodinsky falls, like let's say if it gets like spread out, if the Ukrainians hold on to it, it takes like a month, then yeah, Pokrovsk and Leningrad will be safe. But as soon as Rodinsky falls, you could pretty much count it might be even like a month or less before the entire Pokrovsk-Leningrad area collapses. So we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the south and Donetsk direction. This is where we usually start these videos, and this week is, it's just there's so much interesting things happening in Pokrovsk that that we had to talk about it first. But in South Donetsk, it's another week where a lot of interesting things are happening here. It's just not as sexy as I mentioned last video, but it is still pretty interesting. One of the biggest things is the Russians have captured the village of Kostiantynivka here. What's interesting about now. It's not just the Russians continuously making gains like they have been for the past few weeks. The Ukrainians are doing some interesting things that are spicing things up, but the Russians are still on the forward offensive here. So the beginning of this week, we had the Russians raising their flags over Volskorinsky. Now, a lot of sources are saying that, like, oh, those were not raised in the village itself. We couldn't geolocate it properly. But then we got, so they're like, well, the Ministry of Defense said that they captured this village right here, but we don't know the the geolocate confirmation. We couldn't actually geolocate it based on the videos. But then we had the Ukrainians said, "Oh, look at us! We're in Volskorinsky." They published a video to show that they're still there. But then that was like the midweek, and then towards the latter half of the week, we had geolocate confirmation of the Russians being in the center of this village. So most sources are saying that this village has been captured by the Russians, but it does show that since the Ukrainians, I don't know if that was either an old vid or a counterattack, that it does show that it's very, the Russian positions aren't very secure. It's still precarious. It's still very much possible for the Ukrainians to do counterattacks to try to retake this village. But right now, most sources are saying that Volskorinsky is under Russian control. And so, this is just another village they had to take in the South Donetsk Oblast as they march towards the Volchka River here. I wouldn't be surprised if at the next step the Russians, try to enter Malinovka and start moving towards Shinivka, just to pull up their flanks here so when they move to the north here, they could take Alexandrorod and reach the Volchka River in this direction here. Yeah. And then a little bit more to the north here, where another more interesting thing's happening is that last week we talked about how the Russians entered Novohasky. Well, this week we actually get confirmation of the Russians completely capturing this village. So everything, as we talked about, everything here has been captured by the Russians here. We don't know, like, the extent, there's probably this entire area behind this Volchka River right here is probably in the gray zone. This actually explains, for example, another interesting thing that happens is that the Ukrainians that try to cross this river and enter the village of Yalta. Now that it's not under Ukrainian control. Obviously this would be very hard for the Ukrainians to actually hold. But it does show that that this area because the Ukrainians are still in this northern part, as the Russians march towards the Volchka River, the Ukrainians are still in control on the northern side, and so they could launch counterattacks across this river and plant a flag in Yalta, and then from there, say make a PR victory and then retreat. But so it does show that everything along this river is more of a kind of a gray zone, but it's mostly under Russian control because the Russians are in full control of these areas behind it, and there's no reason for the Ukrainians to be on the other side of this Volchka River because it's just so hard to do supplying. So I do think, but it does show that if the Ukrainians want to, make a PR victory, they could cross the river, and try to say, oh look, we're here and all that. So I do, but it's not that that's not necessarily meaning that the Ukrainians are here. So I would say this area where they say is under Ukrainian control, everything on the other side of this Volchka River, including Yalta, is like more of a gray zone. Where it's not like a fortified Russian position, but it's more under Russian control because the Russians have an easier time supplying it because it's like there's no river they have to cross to actually supply. If they want to go there, but with the Ukraine, it's different for the Ukrainians. So I do think this area is we would say gray zone, but more under Russian influence than Ukrainian influence. But it doesn't mean that. But it does mean that the Ukrainians can't enter this if they want to, with less resistance. But yeah, so that's where it's an interesting dynamic happening. It's not just the Russians curb stomping the Ukrainians here. The Russians are also expanding their foothold across the fields, trying to reach the Volchka River. This map has finally been updated. We talked about the Russians captured Myrnia last week. They captured these fields. This week, they also captured some of these fields here. Some map shows that the Russians are, moving along this highway towards the village of Encirclement, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians, use this highway to then start trying to clear these fields around it. So just slowly but surely moving, using the highway as the main artery to move slowly towards the Volchka River here. Along with this, a lot of sources are saying that now the battle for Zelena High has begun, and the Russians have a small positions in down to the southeastern part of Zelena High. So yeah, that's definitely something that's definitely possible. I think I said definitely a lot there. But anyway, Zelena High is actually a pretty decent sized town, and the Russians with Zelena High and Andriivka Kreslova, which, as you can see, these are not just kind of the small villages. These will be the starting off points for that. If the Russians want to go beyond the Volchka River, like say take Ivanovka and start trying to encircle Novopavlovka from many angles here, they're going to have to use Zelena High and Andriivka to accumulate forces. So taking these two villages would be kind of the culmination battle for liberating South Donbass, and then at that point, the Russians will then start battling in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast here. But yeah, so the Russians are in Zelena High, Novopavlovsky and Vissarionovka has been taken, and we shall see how that continuously develops. And there's been no changes in the Zaporozhye or Kherson directions. Alrighty, now we are going to go to the Kostiantynivka direction. This is also some very interesting things happening, and most of the updates have been happening towards the tail end of this week. So we actually have a lot of things to talk about in this direction here, specifically in this area, where according to a lot of even pro-Ukrainian sources, that the Russians have completely captured the village of Yablunovka, and that the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians mostly out of Alexander Kilinovo. We don't know the extent of it. We do have GLK confirmation of the Russians, being right here, but we don't have the GLK confirmation of the Russians being in this kind of more central part here. But we do know that's kind of this where Lyman kind of has been elongated is where we have GLK confirmation of the Russians being there. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians try to take this other trench network here, try to take this trench network that's here, and then just slowly but surely. Just kind of secure their positions on the this reservoir here, and we still need some. I'm waiting for more updates to see if there's any if the Russians raise their flags all over Yablunovka here, and Alexandra Kilinovo, because as we talked about last week, the Ukrainians are have managed to push Russia out here, but a lot of pro-Ukrainian sources are now saying actually the Russians are in this village, and it's just kind of in this general area where the Ukrainians are. But I wouldn't be surprised. The Russians aren't going to stop until they take at least this area here. Pretty much once here, because then they have all these trench networks that they could use for their own defenses, and then they could have the reservoirs of natural defense, and then the Ukrainians would have to retreat back to the defenses in the Dubobalka, Stepanovka defenses, which defends Kostiantynivka from the west, and then there's a bunch of Berosov, Ilinovka. The Ukrainians will have to then actually use the Kostiantynivka suburbs and Kostiantynivka itself as the next line of defense. So, but once the Russians take this, I don't think they're going to continue. They might, but I don't think they're going to try to attack Kostiantynivka directly. They're going to do what they're doing in Pokrovsk, slowly encircle it. I do think the Russians are going to try to advance into Stepanovka and try to start just slowly encircling Kostiantynivka. But I don't think we're going to see, once the Russians clear everything here, that they're going to start trying to advance towards Berestov and try to enter Kostiantynivka directly. That would be pretty hard. But after the big success in Novopavlovka, the Ukrainians put a bunch of troops in this direction, and that slowed down the Russians for a lot. But it looks like now they're finally losing Lyubunovka and Alexander Kilinovo. Anyway, and then that's something interesting. a bit more to this area here. The Russians also, if they want to actually capture these three villages here that protect the western or part of Kostiantynivka, they would probably, it would be very prudent of the Russians to take Popo Yar, Poltavka, and Rusin Yar. This week, we had, the Russian Ministry of Defense said they have captured Popo Yar. We actually had JLK confirmation of the Russians being there, so I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians have captured this, but, again, it's probably very, like a loose control. Along with this, we actually had GLK confirmation of the Russians being right on the western outskirts of Rusin Yar. So, as you can see, the Russians are pushing through this area, trying to capture these fields here and actually enter the western part. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians actually take fully Rusin Yar. As you can see, it's like a pretty small village here, kind of like Popayar. And the main kind of prize here, which the Ukrainians still have full control over, is the village of Poltavka. As you can see, it's a not a big town, but it's a pretty decent sized village. And if the Russians could take this, this would not only allow them to have a kind of like a starting off point to then they could do two things here. They could either use this to then start flanking operations to try to take these three villages, or they could do flanking operations to the west and help the Russians try to take Sakagovo here, which could they could pull their northern flank up here, because once they take Rodinsky here, you might think, well, if the Russians take everything here and take this area here, that then they might start trying to if they can start moving south. But then, as you can see, this becomes like a kind of like a salient here, and the Ukrainians can use their positions in Doropilia, in Belitsky, and Shakovko as because this is where their next defense line is, and then they can use that to attack your flank here. And if the Russians push northwards here, they could put distance between the Russians storming Pokrovsk and the Ukrainians in the more north here who are trying to break the encirclement here. So yeah, but these three villages are key. So the Russians taking Popoyar, entering Rusin Yar is definitely a good position for the Russians here. Along with this, around in the Toretsk area itself, it's actually very interesting. There was a massive breakthrough here, which I thought was not happening, because I thought there was some sort of I never understood why the Russians weren't able to do this, but they somehow were. Anyway, we had GLK confirmation of the Russians completely capturing the village of Novospassky. We had the Russians raising their flags everywhere in this village. There was some sort of localized breakthrough. Maybe this the Russians entering Alexander Telenovo and entering right on the outskirts of Katerinivka, and the Russians being we have GLK confirmation of the Russians being all over in this area right here and battling for the spine. Because of this, it looks like this is becoming a very deep bad pocket, and the Ukrainians trying to supply here are in a very big trouble. The Ukrainians in Katerinivka and Kable and Balka can be supplied. It's much less constricted, and so forth, and so it's much easier to defend these two villages and defend their trenches all here. But just they have to basically dig themselves into this Russian pocket that's forming, and so that reason they probably left Novospassky. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians also take Sherbrynivka in the near future. So I do think the future for the Russians is something like this. Just trying to liquidate this pocket, and the Ukrainians fall back to better positions. But yeah, so Novospassky has fallen. Along with this, most sources saying the southern part of Sherbrynivka has been taken by the Russians. And so, yeah, this, the Ukrainians in Sherbrynivka and Novospassky are in very big trouble. Novospassky has fallen, and with the fall of these two villages is actually very bad. I could see why the Ukrainians were fighting for it for such a long time. The reason for this is because, now the Russians have these two decent-sized villages that they use to accumulate forces, and then, then they could strike, use the, move along the rail line, and then, use their positions already, in this area to then, attack them from the flank. And then, the main goal for the Russians here is to take everything and then link up, use the reservoirs to have as an actual defense point here. So, we shall see how that develops. Yeah, Novospassky has fallen. Along with this, the Russians are making some solid progress on the more northern part of Toretsk. Actually, today, on Sunday, on July 20th, the Russian Ministry of Defense said they have completely captured the village of Bilohora. Bilohora is this small village right here. Definitely something possible. But all we have is just the Russians being on the more eastern part of this village. But we don't have GLK confirmation of the Russians being kind of in maybe in this kind of more western part of Bilohora. So I would like to see more GLK confirmation of the Russians being here. But it's definitely possible that the Russians have captured Bilohora. Along with this, because of when the Russians have captured this makes sense, because once the Russians have captured Bilohor and have something like this, the Russians are going to be moving along this rail line, trying to reach the village of Alexander Shushina. And in this case, they're making small progress between the two Delivkas here. And this week they made some. Let me show you. They captured more of these fields here. Just moving, moving slightly north. Small steps every week here. So the main goal here is to take everything like this, so that then they can start battling for Alexander Shuchina here. But what's going to make it hard is that the Ukrainians still have positions in this northern part of this. In the southern part, like kind of the Chasiv Yar area. So, what the Russians need to do is, clear up Chasiv Yar, and then, start to, and then they need to focus on taking out this area, and then, kind of, making the, flattening the front like this. So then they could, then reach the southern part of Kostiantynivka here. But, but small progress here. And then in Chasiv Yar itself, in this kind of part of the Kostiantynivka direction in general, there's been no really big changes. The big thing is that the Russians have captured the Shevchenko microdistrict, and the only thing they need to really take is, is to take Mykolaievka, just so then at that point they could then link up and liquidate all the Ukrainians in this forest. And then the only other thing they have to do is take out this area here. So once the Russians take something like this, just anything behind this red line, then they could say they have fully secured Chasiv Yar. So, Chasiv Yar is like 90% taken already. So, it's the hardest part is done. It's just they have to find, after almost a year of battles, the Russians are, they need to finish up here. But, it's a lot of slow progress here. Alrighty. Now we're going to go to the Seversk direction, and in the Seversk direction, there's been some small changes. The battle for Srebrenka is still ongoing. The Russians have not pick the Ukrainians out of the southern part. This is probably because the Russians have not finished their battle for this hill. They have not fully taken. They have taken most of it, but they have not taken all of it, and so that's probably what allows the Ukrainians to hold on to it for such a long time. Now, with that being said, it's they need to basically take this. Now, what they have done this week is that, so Srebrenka, nothing changed there. The battles are still ongoing there. What they have changed is that they're improving their positions around Verkhomanyanska. They're, slowly, they took, a bunch of these tree lines around here. And this is very good because, again, just like in the north, in order to secure their area here, they have to take, this kind of like general, these are, have a higher elevation here. So the Russians improving their flanks around Verkhomanyanska is what they need to be doing. What they need, basically what they need to do is just take the rest of the high-rise, or not the high-rise buildings, the higher elevation status here, just so they can then actually secure Srebrenka and then start, then they have reached the outskirts of Seversk, and at that point, they can then start thinking like what they want to do next. My thoughts is that they're going to then try to outflank it from the north here. That's my guess, but yeah, Seversk is getting closer and closer. It's now actually being activated. Before, they were stuck in Bilohora and there's been no changes, but now it's, it's not, still small progress, but it's something. And then in the Lyman direction, there's actually not been that much changes. The tug-of-war for Rikadup is still ongoing. I think the Ukrainians are still in there, but I don't know if they have fully captured it. So, the Ukrainians are still just, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians aren't even in Novomira or this area. I do think the Russians probably retreated back to maybe, something like, in this area. So I do think, because if the Russians were in Novomira and in this area, then the Ukrainians would not be in Rekadup still. So I do think this northern part of the Lyman place is still a bit more tenuous for the Russians. But we did have Jilika confirmation of the Russians being in, like, Zeleno-Dolinia and, being in Kharkovka. So it's definitely, it's definitely very dynamic here, but, the Ukrainians are still preventing the Russians from, explaining their successes here. But, yeah, Rekadup is still being contested. But besides that, there's been no other real changes here. The only actual change here has been around Gerkivka, more in the northern part here. The Russians taking more of this, more of these tree lines to the east of it. So just pulling up the flanks here. Which is what they should be doing. There's this giant trench network that's up to the west of Gerkivka that I think they should also focus on taking. Luckily, it's in the Luhansk Oblast, so if they could take this, they could, use these trenches to defend themselves. And then from there, then they could continue just taking these tree lines to keep trying to liberate the rest of the Luhansk Oblast here, so. Yeah, and then, I kind of combined the Lyman direction to everything be below this salient here because I've combined Kupyansk with Kharkov. So the I think now that I think about it, I think I'm going to combine the Lyman and Seversk directions because generally speaking, they kind of overlap a little bit. Because if they want to take Lyman, you know, helping take Lyman will help take Seversk, and so this kind of whole area be below this kind of the salient here. So to the south of Kralatovka. So like everything here would be like maybe the Lyman front or something. So instead of like kind of splitting it into, I'll just call it the Lyman front or something like that. But yeah, but speaking of kind of more in the northern part of the Lyman front near Borova, is the Russians are still trying to make their, improve their positions to the north of Borisivki and Drivka. We talked about the Russians, the Leroy Jenkins movement, and entered here. This week we actually look at confirmation of the Russians taking a few more positions here, so it does show that the Russians are still here, but we don't know to what extent. So, but if the Russians could take Borisivki and Drivka and Zelona High here, this would, improve their positions pretty decently here. But we shall see if the Russians can improve their position. Because if the closer the Russians get to this road, the harder it's going to be for the Ukrainians to keep trying to break this salient that, as we talked about like 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Ukrainians did a counterattack and took Zarazovo here. And so, they're trying to liquidate this pocket. But it's getting very hard for the, so if the Russians could, like, take something like this, then all they have to do is do one dash, maybe start batting for Novoplanovka here, and then this would collapse this entire salient here, and then they could, have something like this, and then at that point, that will be a very decent-sized pocket here, or a decent-sized salient, so, and, yeah. So, yeah, that's this Lyman direction. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Kupyansk Kharkov area. I'm trying to think, like, should I call this, like, just the Kharkov direction? Should I call this the Kupyansk direction? Maybe I should call this entire area the Kupyansk direction. I don't know. Like trying to think how to combine this because they're all kind of like in the general like direction, like same thing. But yeah, I don't know what else I would like. I'm trying to think like what I want to call this. Maybe just the Kupyansk direction, maybe the Kharkov direction. I don't know. Maybe Kupyansk, I don't know. But anyway, in the Kupyansk area, actually the most interesting parts are happening in this kind of northeast Kharkov area. But let's talk about Kupyansk itself. Like last week, this kind of string of villages in Kondratovka, Rodovka, Globovka are like being contested. They're not under full control of anybody. But, the Russians seem like they, sometimes are able to have troops there. The thing is that, the Russians are so much of in a hurry in this direction, at least the commanders are, to try to say, oh, look, we're battling for Kupyansk. They're trying to get glory. They don't actually care about, like, the big, the actual small, unglorious things to actually get to glory. They just want to go. That's why they've been saying, oh, we took Moskovko, we took Stoloblovko here. Like, that's, like, complete bullshit. Like, they're not actually in control of that. They're trying to say they're entering Kupyansk, but they're not. So, and because the Russians are pushing south, they're not doing the actual small scale steps of actually improving their bridgehead here. They're not taking Maloshibriki, they're not taking Kostiantynivka. They have, as I mentioned multiple times, they have to take a bunch of these villages here in order to actually, improve their flank here. So they can't just take Dorishny and just move down along the river because then they could just get attacked directly. So they have to expand their bridgehead a bit more. It's like you don't get taking Maloshibriki, Velika Shibriki, Tunisia, these are, villages and, and such, and it's like, it's not as sexy saying you're battling for Kupyansk, right? So, when you take these villages, you don't get as much glory, but it's like, it's not about glory, it's about actually doing what's tactically right to actually secure your big glory. The only way you'll actually start battling for Kupyansk is if you take these villages more to the north here, but because the Russians are trying to rush to get to Kupyansk, them reaching these like kind of suburbs in the north of Kupyansk and being counterattacked here, is they won't ever be able to secure them until they actually start pushing a bit to the west here, improve their bridgehead here a little bit better. But where there's actually been some actual changes for the Russians is in the northeast Kharkov direction. A lot of interesting things. In the Malova area, the Russians are expanding their bridgehead here a little bit. They have captured some more of these in these tree lines. Not much, but it does show that this, it's starting to seem that this area was just something that the Russians were using to as just something to draw Ukrainian reserves. I think the Russians have a very interesting idea they're doing here. They attacked Nemolova. Also this week, they have completely captured this small village of Dyryania here. this village right here. This makes sense because it's like sticking out into the Russian area. And so, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians keep like opening up new fronts in this area. Maybe the Russians attack through here and try to, just slowly but surely poke holes into the Ukrainian defense here. And so, at that point, then the Ukrainians have plugged up multiple areas, and then that might draw Ukrainian reserves away from here. So, yeah, the Russians are have opened another area up here, but I don't think they'll advance much more here. This is just gonna open up another small front here, just so they can make the Ukrainians, have to plug multiple holes here. But yeah, slow but steady progress here. But where there's been very much interesting things is in the Volchansk direction, this area right here. And last week we talked about how the Russians maybe crossed the river, we don't know. But this week we actually had geolocated confirmation that the battle for the butter factory is ongoing. This factory holds the key to the southern part of Volchansk. We had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being all over this factory. And so we don't know if the Russians have fully taken it yet, but we do know that the Russians have crossed this river. Even the pro-Ukrainian sources are saying that the Russians have crossed this river and have captured a huge chunk of this this forest area. And because of this, the Russians could hide troops here, and then maybe infiltrate and try to set up shop in this residential area in the southwestern part of Volchansk. But if the Russians could take the butter factory, and then take everything behind this rail line here, then basically the battle for Volchansk is almost over. I think the Ukrainians could fall back to the southern part, like the very south here, where there's a bunch of high-rise buildings, but I think these high-rise buildings have been wiped out. I know that most of Volchansk have been burned to the ground, specifically the northern part, but I don't know if the southern part is still still standing. Maybe got razed to the ground as well. But anyway, the butter factory is being fought over, and if the factory could be taken, the Russians could use that to accumulate forces. So yeah, it looks like instead of stopping on the northern part of Volchansk, the Russians are now expanding to, maybe this is just a way to force the Ukrainians to put soldiers in Volchansk. So the Kharkov direction is interesting. They're using a tactic of like attacking in multiple areas, opening up new fronts to drag Russians there or the Ukrainians there. But let's see if it gets pulled off. Alrighty, now we're going to go lastly to the Sumy direction, and this week we have some very interesting updates. The biggest is that the battle for Yunatovka is finally coming to an end. This is where the Russians will use as their logistics hub for a while. It's not completely liberated, but we have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being here. So I think they have about like 85% of this town taken. As you can see, this is the biggest capture for or almost the biggest capture of the Russians in this area. This will be where the Russians could accumulate forces. And once they fully capture Yunatovka and push the Ukrainians fully out of here, they probably will focus on the village of Satki and try to take these forests to the east of it. And then once they capture that, and they take Varashina here, for which I think they took, but there's not been confirmed yet. But once they take something like this, then they'll be in a very good position. But at that point, I don't think they're going to continue pushing towards the second line. It looks like the Sumy offensive was something that, the Ukrainians pulled a bunch of troops from here, and then the Russians exploited it by sending troops here. So, that's why we saw a lot of rapid success about a month ago. But now that's, now it's kind of stopped. So I think the Russians are just going to secure themselves on the first line of the Sumy defenses, and then the Ukrainians will retreat back to the second line, and then it will be kind of like a stalemate again. And then where the Ukrainians are counterattacking in Kostiantynivka here, we had the Russians bombing themselves and bombing the Ukrainians in the northern part. The Ukrainians have not fully kicked out the Russians from this area here, so the battle for Kostiantynivka is still ongoing. But if the Ukrainians could kick the Russians out of here, then the Russians will probably retreat back, to behind this kind of little river area here, and retreat back kind of in this area, and this kind of taking back Kostiantynivka really much, prevents, kind of sabotages the Russian operation to get to Khotin here. So it's, which is the key to the second line of the Ukrainian defenses here. So yeah, very interesting things. And then in this Techno area, as you can see, this map has been updated. The Russians have fully captured Techno and are now, they took this village last week, and they are, apparently they're trying to enter the village of Razivsky here, but we don't have a confirmation of that just yet. But yeah, the Sumy thing is, this is still an active front. Yunatovka will be a very big gain for the Russians, will be a very big logistics hub, and somewhere they could accumulate forces. But it's, But, you know, it's a lot of back and forths here. Anyway, that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates. Like this video, comment your thoughts, share this video around. Keeping awesome. This is the summer offensive is in full swing, and shit is just getting crazy. So aim high and wander on.